Welcome to episode number 14 with Mark Robnett, CIO of the Justice Federal Credit Union, where he talks about how to build a world-class IT security, tactics and strategy boardroom presentation.
Fear is infectious, and once fear grips a board, it's not a good thing.
Hello, and you are listening to Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. If you are listening for the first time, I interview leaders who inspire me in the areas of hardcore IT security, IT business leadership, innovation, creativity, entrepreneurship, and fearless living principles. Welcome to the show.
You are really going to enjoy this episode with Mark Robnett, who's the CIO of Justice Federal Credit Union. Mark is a rising star in the credit union industry, and I asked him to detail for you in this episode how he put together his presentation to his board regarding his IT security strategy and tactics. Now, credit unions are interesting because not only do they have to support tens of thousands of customers, which they call members, but they also, from a regulator point of view, have to abide by very strict requirements for disaster recovery, security, and infrastructure. So they typically are doing a lot with a little. Mark has the added pressure of having very smart and a technically savvy board. There's no hiding behind jargon and complexity with them because the board is comprised of FBI and the Justice Department. What a challenge Mark has on his hands. This is a treat. Take out a pencil to take lots of notes, and I hope you enjoy the show. I appreciate you for coming on and joining me.
Oh, not a problem. Thank you for inviting me.
So, Mark, you are the VP of IT for Justice Federal Credit Union. And, one thing I didn't ask you is, what was your journey like from when you started out of college to this position you're in right now as the VP of IT? If you could, I'd love to hear the Cliff Notes version of how you were able to get to that level.
Wow. Okay. Well, let's say out of college, I kind of have to rewind. Prior to college, I interned for a bank for 3 summers. And I'm thinking, hey, it's a great little job, getting acclimated to the financial industry. Not that this was my goal in any way, but I think that was a precursor for me getting here because when I graduated from college, a data processor in the financial industry that caters to credit unions, which is Fiserv, contacted me for a position. And so I got a job the semester before I graduated and started working that December, and it seemed to be, I would say, destined, I guess, because I went from that to working for another data processor, this time on the West Coast, and then from there, I spent just under 8 years working there, and then moved on to a credit union, and I've been in this space ever since.
Well, that's great. That's great. I always like hearing how people got to where they are, and because knowing a little bit about where you landed at Justice Federal Credit Union through the years, this is a credit union that is probably on par with credit unions that are 2 and 3 times its size. So that must have been quite a shift to go from credit union you were at to a credit union of the intensity that Justice has. Can you give a little perspective of what it's like to be a VP of IT at Justice Federal Credit Union and a little bit about who makes up your board?
Okay. Well, it's all about pace. We operate at a pretty furious pace around here. As you stated, we operate, well above our asset size. So in that, where we're always trying to get to market with the same products and services that, the bigger credit unions or bigger banks offer even. So that's always material on our mind. So again, that leads to a pretty furious pace in IT as we look to support the organization and operations specifically. Excuse me, Bill, I forgot the second half of your question.
No, that was perfect. And I think what's really interesting, Mark, about Justice is that, and about really the credit unions overall, is that you're audited by the NCUA, which is under the financial services umbrella of FIFIC. You have to meet very stringent disaster recovery requirements, very stringent security requirements, and you have to do that on an essentially a limited budget. That seems like quite a challenge.
Oh, it is. And obviously there's only so much money to go around. And the more IT soaks up, the less that's there for operations and the products and services that truly drive the organization. So it really is a balancing act, and that's where leveraging our internal knowledge and vendor-specific knowledge comes in handy, because we don't have money to waste on things, so we have to find best of breed that fits our budget pretty quickly, and then try to deploy quickly as well.
Today we wanted to cover you had a board meeting a couple weeks ago in which the board had wanted a comprehensive presentation and review of IT security presented by you. And this was quite a shift. And I really, for our listeners, I think having worked with you through this process and spending some time and understanding and looking at how you handled this, I thought it was quite masterful. And what do you think precipitated that type of an inquiry by the board from you about looking into the depths of the IT security program at Justice?
I would say by and large, it was the year of 2014, which they're calling the year of the intrusion. Our board is a very educated board, all of which are employed by the federal government. So they read everything, and more these questions were surfacing in board meetings, or it was just general banter about, hey, well, did you see that this happened just last night or last week? So the increased awareness came from just the media, that the things that are going on around them. And again, this isn't some top secret thing that, only the government employees have access to. I'm sure some of them may have access to other information, but it was just the things that were showing up on CNN and MSNBC. And so it became, I think it reached a fever pitch in a way, and they asked me to put together a presentation on IT security as it stood in the wild, or something that every institution is facing, and also how it affects Justice FCU, essentially what our posture is and how we're combating today's threats.
So let's get into the specifics on that, because I think that's what I found very fascinating in listening to your approach of how you tackled this, because I think that a lot of the CIOs that are going to be facing this over the next 2 years, some that are very sophisticated like your organization have already faced this, but most have not, unless they're a larger organization where this is kind of about a year ago it started for them. So what steps did you immediately take? If we peel this onion back, I really want to see, what did you do with your core staff and your core peer group at Justice, and also who you report to? So what was your thinking just with that area first?
Well, I would say my thinking there was to kind of walk through the things we are doing. Obviously, I read everything as well, things that are going on in the industry and the tools that are available to us. So kind of mapping out where we need to go, first off, where we are, where we need to go, and prognosticate how we get there. So, running through those things with internal staff, my boss, and then reaching out to, trusted vendors, like Red Zone to kind of, work through that was the first step. Then I would say leveraging all that knowledge, putting it together in a package that first and foremost was digestive is very important. You have to know the audience. So I kind of knew where some of the flare-ups might come from. So gaining some support from those people early on, I kind of dropped some seeds during the course of the year, talking through security, talking through their concerns, and giving them some insight as to what we're doing on certain fronts, even if the technology was foreign to them, which was probably 99% of them. Just kind of give them a little more confidence that, hey, we're where we put something in place, hopefully to combat that. Now we don't have the deep pockets that some of the major organizations have, Target or Walmart or what have you, but we can look for best of breed products that fit our mold, our asset size, if you will. So that was another very, very important step, was to get them involved, to onboard them prior to the presentation.
I don't mean to interrupt, but I think that one of the pieces, having been a fly on the wall of that board presentation, the questions coming from the Justice Department and FBI leaders, they were spot on. And you had a very cost-effective APT and malware prevention programs in place that were part of the overall program. And it was interesting how you talked about the strategy, but then also got really much into the details. Like, you weren't the wrench turner, of course, from installing it, but you had to you were governing and you had to say, no, I had policemen on the street in this area of the city to deal with that flare-up. And that flare-up was the APT. So I thought it was interesting how you handled that and very astute.
Thank you, Bill. I appreciate that. And obviously, it takes a team. And I think that was another element of the presentation was that, and hence why, I invited Red Zone in so that they understood that this is not like the Army commercials where it's an army of one. I mean, I don't think we would be very successful, or anyone would be in today's world, if they put all their eggs in one bucket, or they win it alone, if you will, lone wolf style. So I think it was very important for them to understand that, hey, with all of the combined knowledge we have as the IT department here, we still need help. We have to keep the business running. We have to look outward for the threats that are imminent, the things that are happening today, and then, figure out a plan on how we handle that stuff. And since you were there, Bill, on the clear, you understand we kind of got into the discussions of what we're doing, but also on the flip side of the prevention is, hey, what do we do when actually something happens? So getting into a discussion about the insurance and how we leverage that into things. We place bets with our insurance carrier and kind of talk through a little bit of, how I did a review of our insurance and just trying to see what's covered. And in today's world with the intrusions coming so fast and furious, I mean, do we have the proper coverages? That was another question that had to be answered.
Well, yeah, I think that is huge because that's a new area, and boards want to know that you're looking at all angles, and you're in the risk management. You're delivering peace of mind. Your organization, your IT organization, delivers peace of mind, and I think that was really important to bring up that insurance concept because that market is in flux right now so much that. Okay, while we're talking about insurance, but you also brought up disaster recovery.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, remember that conversation a couple months ago? We started talking about disaster recovery and how really IT security issues right now are really DR events. I mean, shoot, that came right up in the meeting, and that was interesting.
No, absolutely. And, from the discussion I think you and I had, we do tabletop exercises with our disaster recovery company that we contract with, but none of it caters toward a security incident, none of it. And so when I asked our vendor, well, where are you guys on this front? I mean, can we expect some type of tabletop exercises that you guys can come in and do with us? And there's virtually nothing. His response to me was if we came up with something, they could help us test it. So that was very telling.
That, I think, and you mentioned also the concept of flare-ups. I think this is the part where, the CIO can't rely on vendors for this part. It has to be part of their leadership and their gaining constituent support amongst the team is, from what I understand, I think it would be really interesting to hear from others what you did to understand those flare-ups and where they might be. In relation to over the past several board meetings, there had been concerns brought up, and then you had to craft the presentation to deal with those in particular. So, for example, how do you deal with the fact that these board members are going to be on planes and they're going to pull out the back seat, the latest magazine, and read about cloud?
Right. Okay. So that's an interesting one because currently we don't do anything in the cloud today, but them understanding what the cloud means, that's kind of some of the pre-work. I do in the board meetings is to get them a level of comfort with the technology. Most of our board members are not technology people. We have one or two who kind of understand technology. So bringing the conversation down to a conversational level, not using a lot of jargon is very important. So when we go through and explain things like, okay, this is what utilizing systems in the cloud means. This is what security in the cloud looks like if we were to go down this avenue. Those are the kind of things that I think, really helped propel the presentation well before we got there, so they knew exactly what to expect.
Yeah, I think that you handle that very well because the media issues that surround security right now are something that are very difficult for the CIO to handle. And some of the questions that popped up in the board meeting were like, you had already preempted that in your presentation. Nobody had to go back to you and say, well, how are we internally preventing the Home Depot from happening to us?
Right.
You had a slide dedicated to that, which was you sort of took the legs out of the conversation because you had already spent some time addressing that.
Absolutely. And, again, they read everything. I mean, and most boards should read everything. Most people still read the equivalent of a newspaper, whether that's, Yahoo News or MSNBC or what have you. So, again, trying to get ahead of it is kind of how I approached it in the presentation. So I knew that there were some fears around things like Target and Home Depot and all the others. So I dedicated a whole slide to it and then tried to link them to, okay, hey, the next step for me was, what do the bad guys look like? Who do we think the bad guys are? Our board, I think that the assumption was that these bad guys were in Pakistan, Uzbekistan, or somewhere like that, some foreign nationals. And I'm sure that is a piece of the pie, but kind of walking them through who the real actors are was critical as well. I mean, most of them don't know, though most of the intrusions are originated right here in the United States. So educating them on that point was critical as well.
So what outcome did you want? How are you defining success with your presentation at the board? Like, what was the absolute outcome you were looking for from, and let's say you had to talk to your CEO the following day or talk to a board member the following day. What would you define success being from the presentation?
I would define that success as them leaving wanting to know more and them not feeling overwhelmed. I think that there were some good questions that came out of that conversation. I don't think that there was a lot of I don't understand or I don't get it kind of thing. So I think that played materially to how the presentation was geared, using the right terms so that things were digestible to them. But this is the beginning of a conversation, an ongoing conversation that we're going to start having now, and it's going to continue on. So to me, that means that it was successful because I wanted them to understand that this is the world we live in now. It's not going to go back to the way it was in 2000 where you didn't hear about these things. So to me, that was the success measure.
Well, I think one of the pieces that giving a sense of peace of mind was one of the pieces that came out of that board meeting is a feeling that the CIO had examined all bases and gave them a visual representation of having done a thorough analysis of all areas of the organization.
I'd agree with that. But you know how that goes. Peace of mind. You have it one day, you don't have it the next. Things change. The other side of that is getting them comfortable with, any board, comfortable with the fact that it is an ever-changing landscape and that it's not static. Okay, and I think most people, we have a tendency, obviously, to gravitate toward the things that are static, sits in a box. I can trust it. I know that it's there. It's going to do what it's supposed to do, and we're protected. Clearly, we are protected. We have multiple technologies in place, layered technologies to protect us, but just getting the awareness level raised to the activities that IT is endeavoring upon, also the activities that the bad guys are endeavoring upon, understanding the actual playing field, I think, was very important. And I think they walked away with a greater understanding of all that. Peace of mind, yes, definitely. So we definitely talked through kind of what we're doing to protect the organization. But I think more importantly was they understood who the players were on our side of the fence, not just JFCU, IT, but Red Zone, Alert Logic, all of the other players that play an integral part in securing the organization.
Well, see, that's the thing, though, that you showed a level of, I think there's strength. You can have strength through vulnerability. I think sometimes when a leader says they're going to go it alone and I don't need vendors, I don't need, I just need my staff and I'll present this and I'll win by myself. I think you took a completely different approach and you said, I have a team and we have these risks and I'm going to show you where our risks are. And you approached it the way the financial part of the organization approaches finance, which they've been doing for decades. It's a risk-based approach to managing your members. And you applied that same risk-based approach to the IT organization. And I think that was different.
Well, I look at it as that's what we do here as a financial institution. We're managing risk every day. And IT is no different. There's risk that has to be mitigated. So I think that's a very valid approach today.
Well, that's the thing, though. I think sometimes the people are like, what do you mean? There's risk? There's risk in IT? You mean I'm potentially insecure? But I think you didn't run around saying we're insecure. You said, we have to made all the appropriate investments in the areas that are the known, but here are the risk areas. And I think you had presented, in a visual chart using the scoreboard tool. I think you showed like 40 or 50 different areas of risk. I think that was a very powerful way for you to show the program.
No, I agree. And I think that was received extremely well because, it was visual. So, they can kind of see, okay, well, we rate here based on industry best practices, standards, regulators, compliance models, all that sort of stuff. But we were able to kind of step through all these layers of security relatively quickly and give them an understanding kind of where we are and why we are where we are. So I think that was received very well. But it also, I think, played to the aspect of living in reality, that there's no silver bullet, no magic bullet that's going to protect us from stuff. We have to take the appropriate steps through these multiple vectors.
So how are you going to handle the conversation moving forward between compliance-based security, making sure that you pass the compliance audits, and real IT security, the real practical security that you need to combat the real threats? Like, how are you going to do that moving forward and communicate that?
Well, I think how we do that is, obviously, we have to be compliant. We have to follow the directions of our regulators, but being diligent as to the changes that are occurring in the industry is one component. I think the greatest component is leveraging trusted vendors and their knowledge that they're bringing to the table. One validates the other. So, if we're using, one vendor for, risk assessments, it's completely independent of maybe the tools that we're using from AlertLogic, and that's completely different from the tools that we're using from Red Zone. In the middle of all that, I think there's going to be some synergy. And, obviously we're going to get compliant. We work very hard at that. I think that's probably more of the low-hanging fruit today. The truly alive security program, I think, is very dynamic. We understand that it's not static anymore. It's more of a living document. So we're evolving as the threats evolved. And we're educating ourselves. We're seeking education from our vendors. We're working with our vendors in tandem. I think that's the way forward.
That's an interesting point. And you have a real dynamic action-based IT security program. And it's not just every 6 months having an audit on IT security. And I think that's a shift that you definitely have made. And you made that apparent at the board level.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. I think if we're doing the right things daily, the audits will never be a problem. And I think we've reached a place where we're doing the right things daily to where, we can kind of keep our eyes a little more on the horizon and kind of seeing what's coming now. So I look at it as going from more of a defensive model to an offensive one. And I think that speaks to, the real security statement that you made is, obviously real security means, hey, you're conscious of those threats and you're being offensive, not just defensive.
You're standing outside the credit union with a shotgun, basically.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Maybe a couple of machetes or something.
That's great. So let's talk about fear for a second. As an IT leader, you have quite a job in your role, and you have your members, your membership, customers, et cetera, that depend on you for banking and financial services. And then you have your internal users you're supporting, and you've got a board that and you've got your boss, the CEO. What keeps you up at night in your role?
What I don't know. That's probably it. What I don't know keeps me up. So, fear is infectious. And once fear grips a board, it's not a good thing. It's extremely bad, especially fear of the unknown, which technology IT tends to be for probably 90% of them. So how I combat that is to try to stay educated. Again, make sure that I'm reading up on the things that are occurring, and I have a few contacts within the FBI now, and they kind of keep me abreast as to maybe what they're seeing as well. So that's kind of how I control my own fear about the things I do not know. But that also helps me quell some of the fears and concerns of our board members as well.
Well, absolutely. I appreciate your honesty with that. I think the profession, the CIO, is a very powerful role these days, and there's no direct education path for being a world-class CIO. And unlike some of the more mature professions like accounting, for example, or human resources, which go back into the 20s, 30s, and 40s of last century, the CIO profession is really relatively new from maybe the mid 80s. So we're learning these skills real time. And it's just not a whole lot of precedence for it. 50 years from now, maybe there will be. So what would you do if one of your peers called you up and said, I've got to prepare for a board presentation? What would be, and can you give me like 5 key points? What would you tell them now that you've been through this intense process in preparing for this one you just had? What would you say to them?
First, I'd say get a good joke. I think it's important to ease the tension a bit. It tends to be such an important topic. People are kind of waiting with bated breath to hear what you have to say. So when you can add some levity and link it to the subject matter, I think that's always a good idea. Then I would say kind of think through your process, or the goals you want to achieve with the presentation. And because when you have a clarity of the goals or the process and what it is you're trying to convey, I think it's just infinitely easier for you to get through it. The third thing I would say would be don't be afraid of what's going on today. Go ahead and address the current threats immediately. This way you can kind of diffuse it a bit. This way people who walk in with notions, Target, or it's this or it's that, you can kind of say, hey, we're aware of it, we're addressing it, and I'm willing to have this discussion head on. So I think that's very important as well if you're going to have this conversation. Be aware of the ping pong ball type of conversations that could break out, going from one side of the room to the other. I think if you're doing your job at the board meeting and you're, kind of reading the personalities and maybe some of their fears, at least the level of fear, you can kind of diffuse that a little bit prior to the board presentation, maybe seeking them out individually and having maybe an offline conversation with the ones who may be really gripped with that fear or just maybe have more to offer to the conversation. I think that'll go a long way as well because you'll just increase their faith in you that you know what you're doing. So when you go to present, you're not going to get hit with questions that you're unprepared for. And I would say, in conclusion, I just think it's very important, especially in our vein here in the financial institution realm, because it's going to be ever present moving forward, is that you want to leave them wanting more. You want to give them just enough to whet the appetite with these types of presentations so that, they're interested and, they can't wait to hear what you may have to say about what's happening or how your credit union or your business is responding to those threats. So if they're feeling that way, then I think they're feeling good about where they are and they have faith that where the organization needs to go.
Yeah, and I think just to harp on that, you actually had the presentation presented before the presentation was presented. I mean, at least that appeared to me. You had actually gone pretty deep. You had gone to individual board members to find out their concerns. You had spent time with them to make sure that their individual concerns that you asked them. You spent time asking them what what they thought about this approach, that approach. I mean, you were not surprising them in the board meeting. You had gone to you had done the same thing at the CEO. You had gone to your COO. I mean, you had really done your homework well in advance for this, and you had really deeply invested time with your core vendors like Red Zone and others. Your staff, I mean, you really had done your research so that you could eliminate all points of surprise. You call them the flare-ups or the random question that pops up. You had really limited that so you could address the strategy at the meeting.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's just part of knowing the playing field, knowing your board, knowing their personalities, obviously, knowing your boss and, your team. So these guys are all here really to help you and support you in the security vision for the credit union or whatever your business is. But I think that's, as you stated, was infinitely valuable here. And again, I knew all month that I had 30 days to kind of get it together. So again, I didn't rest on my laurels. It's doing the right things every day to prepare for that. I think is infinitely one of the greater takeaways from this is preparing daily, diffusing situations before they arise or flare up, as we're calling them. I think that's just going to serve you very well when you get to the presentation. And again, obviously practicing and all that stuff. But if you've done all those things, when you get to actually presenting, it should just kind of be very fluid. You should get through it. I don't think that you'll get much feedback from the board if you've kind of addressed a lot of those concerns ahead of time either.
So what are your thoughts on mentorship? Do you believe in mentors?
Oh, undoubtedly. I have a few mentors right now, both ways. I have a couple people that I mentor within the organization here, and I have mentors in the industry and outside. I think you could never have enough mentors. And I think I have a few really good ones.
And are they mentors that are career mentors as like 100%, or do you have mentors that you leverage in other areas, like maybe, health and like physical fitness, or is it mostly mentors and coaches and within your industry?
Oh, it's both. It's definitely both. I think that, and some, straddle the line. Maybe they start off a business or career type mentor, and then it shifts, to something else. I picked at least one up with every job change I've ever had. So I have those types of mentors, and then just mentors in my everyday life, church and what have you, things that I get involved in. But I think that speaks to, always evolving, always trying to better yourself and learn, usually from people who've gotten there first. They've been there before. So, a lot of them have valuable knowledge to impart if one just wants to listen.
Yeah, and I think that's a strength that you have, and it's not easy to reach out to mentors sometimes, because I think it puts people in a position of being vulnerable, like they have to admit that they don't know everything. But I think that's a real strength for leaders to find people, if they can be humble enough to realize they don't know everything. I think it actually makes them more powerful, because it leverages a knowledge pool beyond themselves. And I think certainly in the career space that we're talking about, it's just impossible to know everything. And but as a human being, as a leader within the organization, I think that's very wise what you're saying. Very, 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 very wise, Mark.
Well, I appreciate that, Bill. And, I think the thing is, my mom would always say, know thyself. You know what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are. And, obviously we all work to strengthen those weaknesses, but you can do that much faster and easier if you work together with someone else. If you tap into someone who's been there before. It's just wasted knowledge if we do not. Again, I'm very aware of the things I'm pretty good at. I'm aware of things I'm not very good at, but I'm not, arrogant enough to think that I don't need any help.
Well, this has been a great conversation. I think there's quite a bunch of nuggets here that we kind of uncovered, and your experience, and I appreciate you for sharing your experience of this very important skill set, which is actually being able to present something that's very complex in a very action-oriented way to people that are incredibly important to an organization, and help give guidance and governorship at the board level. So I appreciate you for sharing this.
Oh, not a problem. I appreciate you for asking. Hopefully I'll come back.
Yes, absolutely. So until next time, Mark, thank you very much. And I'm going to put in the show notes. What would you say the best way for people to, if they have questions, to reach out to you? Would you prefer them to reach you through LinkedIn or email? What would be the best way for them to reach out to you?
Yeah, either way, LinkedIn or email would be great.
Okay. Well, we'll put on the show notes different options for people to reach out to you. But again, thank you very much for sharing your knowledge.
So this wraps up episode 14 with Mark. I hope that it was a educational episode for you, as I think this topic about communicating to the CEO and the board is incredibly important for the CIO. And just a quick note about our sponsor, Red Zone Technologies. There's a tool that I have been using working with CIOs now for a couple years called the CIO Scoreboard, which I had developed a couple years, but is particularly becoming important as the scrutiny on IT security is becoming more intense for CIOs at the board and the CEO level. And the challenge is, how do you abstract the complexity across all the security domains from your staff regarding all of the technologies and the domains within the organization? So how do you abstract that complexity and present it in a visual way and an actionable way so that a board and a CEO can actually understand it from a business point of view and take action, and present it in a way that is similar to risk that they would have to absorb from buying insurance on a building? So take a look at redzonetechnologies.net and look at the scoreboard section. And I think it's particularly relevant from today's conversation. So with that, I look forward to seeing you in episode number 15. Thank you and enjoy your day. So there you have it. This wraps another episode of Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. To get all the relevant show notes, please go to our blog at www.redzonetech.net/podcast. Additionally, make sure you go to iTunes and leave your comments in iTunes about the show. This helps our show rankings enormously, and it helps support the show. Until next time, I appreciate you very much for listening. Thank you.